Hello, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to the Holistic Trauma Healing Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsey Lockett, and we are continuing our Nourish Your Nervous System series. And today I'm really excited because I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things to nourish, which is our emotions. Because just like we are physical creatures with physical bodies, we also have minds, so we're mental creatures. We have ancestry, which I talked about in the last episode, so we need to nourish our ancestry. We also have emotions and we have spirits, and all of these different parts of us come together and weave together to create the whole person that we are. And so we have to nourish ourselves in wholeness. And our nervous systems are the dictator of how we show up in our lives. Our nervous systems are informing how we communicate, what patterns we have in our relationships, the voices in our heads, and the overthinking and the stories that we tell ourselves. Our nervous systems are determining if our spiritual connection is one of clarity and if spiritual messages can come through loud and clear, or if there's a lot of interference. Our nervous systems are just in charge of so much about our lives. And it's important that we not just treat the nervous system like this tangible 3D biological thing, but that we zoom out and see how crucially important it is for literally every level of our existence. Our nervous system is in control of our emotional state, it's in control of our mental state, it's in control of our physical bodies and what we feel in our physical bodies. It's in control of so much. So nourishing it isn't just about regulating your nervous system. It's not just about learning a bunch of nervous system tools. It's so much more than that. I believe that our nervous systems is the thing that ties together all the parts of us that make us up as whole persons. The nervous system ties it all together. It's the web that is holding all of the parts of us together. And so we can't neglect this part of the web over here, the physical part of the web over here, and just focus on the spiritual part, right? We can't neglect the emotional part of the web and just focus on the mindset stuff, right? We have to address all parts of it. And that's what I've been talking about in this Nourish Your Nervous System series. So if this is your first time listening to the podcast, or if you're picking up in the middle of this series at this episode, I want to encourage you to stop this episode and just go back to the very first Nourish Your Nervous System episode and just start listening from the beginning, because every episode in this series builds on the episodes before it. So if you are caught up and you're ready for the next installment of Nourish Your Nervous System, today we're going to be talking about emotional nourishment. And so it's just really important to just name out loud, clearly, what aversions, resistances, and judgments we have about feelings and emotions. In our culture, I'm talking about Western culture. I don't know anything about Eastern cultures really, so I can't speak to that. But in Western culture, there is a very strong aversion to accepting, embracing, and feeling our feelings. We tend to make feelings the problem. We label feelings as good or bad, as positive or negative, and we intellectualize and psychoanalyze our feelings, but that's not the same as truly feeling our feelings. We pathologize feeling, right? We make feeling mean that there's something wrong with us, that it's an indicator or it's proof that something is not as it should be and that it needs to be changed or fixed or modified in some way. But feelings are not pathological. They're not good or bad. They're just energy. Emotions are energy in motion, as Peter McWilliams famously said. Emotions are just energy. And energy is not good or bad. It just is. So when we avoid our true feelings, we're doing so because we don't know how to meet our feelings with awareness. Why? Why don't we know how to feel what we feel and meet it with presence, love, and curiosity? Why do we meet it with judgment? Why do we meet it with, oh, I'm not supposed to be feeling this way. Oh, this means there's something wrong. Oh, this is a bad feeling. Oh, I'm not being positive. That's only meeting our feelings with judgment. That's not meeting our feelings with presence, love, and curiosity. So why don't we meet our feelings with presence, love, and curiosity? Not surprising. childhood trauma and conditioning, right? You have been conditioned to pathologize your feelings. You have been conditioned to think that there is such a thing as good feelings and bad feelings. So, for example, think back to your childhood. When your parents punished you or sent you to your room or hit you or shamed you for having normal childhood feelings, that sent the very strong message to you that your feelings were unacceptable and that having those feelings or expressing those feelings would result in some kind of separation from your parent, whether that was actual physical separation or emotional separation. And so as a child, you're going to do anything to avoid that devastating feeling of separation from your parents, right? That feeling for a child is not just, oh, this is inconvenient that I don't feel connected to my parents. In a child's body, that separation is literally life and death. And so because the separation is life and death, as a child, we are subconsciously wired for survival more than we are wired for quality of life. The limbic part of our brains that is controlling all of our survival patterns and controlling our nervous system responses is not actually concerned with the quality of your life. It's only concerned with keeping you alive. So we then put on these adaptive behaviors that are always meant to be temporary, like people pleasing, perfectionism, walking around on eggshells, numbing, dissociating, being constantly busy, all that kind of stuff. But because we put on these what are supposed to be temporary adaptive patterns, we stay embodied in those patterns and then they become what we think are our personality. But they were only ever meant to be temporary states, but then they turn into long-term personality traits. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Gabor Mate. He says, when a child is born, the child has two needs. The first need is for attachment, contact, connection, love. Without that, the human child does not survive. Of all mammals, humans exhibit the longest period of dependency on their parents. Attachment is a huge need to connect, belong, be loved by, and love. But we have another need as well, which is authenticity. And authenticity is the capacity to know what we feel, to be in touch with our bodies, and to be able to express and manifest who we are in our activities and relationships. So what happens to a child when their attachment need is incompatible with their authenticity need? Meaning, if I'm authentic, my parents are going to reject me. It's too much for my parents to handle it when I acknowledge and express my true feelings, when I insist on my own truth, right? A child throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of a grocery store is a child insisting on their own truth. Parents are conveying those messages. This is unacceptable. You're going to get rejected if you have this feeling. Don't behave this way. It's not appropriate. I'm going to punish you if you do this. They convey these messages unconsciously all the time. I don't think it's because they mean to. I don't think it's because they don't love us as children. I don't think it's because parents aren't trying their best, although I think that there are a lot of parents who are not trying their best. I think it's because that our parents were raising us while they were still suppressed, traumatized, and stressed themselves. What does a child do with that? What does a child do with being raised by a parent who's suppressed, traumatized, and stressed themselves? It's an impossible situation for a child. So Gabor Mate goes on to say, giving up their attachment for authenticity, the child loses the relationship on which their life depends. There is no question. What becomes suppressed is our authenticity, our emotions. Then we're 25, 30, 35, 40, and we don't know who we are. We don't know what we feel. We have a strong gut feeling, but we ignore it. At some point, we found it too costly for our attachment relationships to be in touch with our feelings. So as a child, when you were a child, when I was a child, choosing between attachment and authenticity is impossible. There really isn't a choice, not actually, because a child can't survive without their parents. The survival instinct pushes them to figure out how to regain attachment using any means necessary. So then the child just becomes accustomed to choosing, pleasing, serving, and appeasing other people. So the child is unconsciously sacrificing authenticity over and over and over again to retain attachment to other important relationships even long after they've outgrown their need to rely on parents for survival, right? It becomes the personality trait. So now you're repeating the same patterns in adult relationships as you did in your child relationship, but you're a fully grown adult and you're doing this in relationships that aren't even relationships with parents. Or you may still be in the same pattern of relationships with parents. So our adaptive survival responses, when I say adaptive survival response or adaptive survival pattern, I'm talking about the unconscious sacrificing of our authentic nature in an attempt to retain the love, connection, and attention of our parents, or to protect ourselves from being hurt in adult relationships. And very, very often we project the patterns that we once had with parents, siblings, and other authority figures onto our present day relationships. So it's almost like you get in an argument with your spouse, and in that moment when you're really triggered, you're not actually arguing with your spouse. You have projected the face of your mother or the face of your father or the face of a bullying teacher onto your partner's face. And now you're in conflict with something that doesn't even really exist because it's so triggering to you, right? So we project these patterns that we once had with parents and other authority figures onto our present day relationships. In addition to that, one of the most common hallmark signs of complex PTSD is minimizing our childhood experiences. The most common thing that I hear someone say when they're saying, I didn't have that bad of a childhood. I don't really have a lot of trauma. My partner has had way more trauma than me. They had it way worse than me. I don't really know what's wrong with me. The most common thing they say is, I didn't have it that bad. My childhood wasn't that bad. As if the fact that you didn't lose everything in a natural disaster or experience overt physical or sexual abuse is the only form of trauma. The minimizing of trauma, the phrase, well, I didn't have it that bad, my childhood wasn't that bad, is how I know someone has complex PTSD. Because minimization is such a huge part of complex PTSD. We don't realize that this belief, oh, I didn't have it that bad, is actually trauma comparison. And we compare our painful and undigested emotional experiences to the painful and undigested emotional experiences of other people. And then we judge that our painful emotional experiences don't measure up in severity. The idea that any one flavor of trauma is better than or more preferable to another flavor of trauma is sad. It's really, really sad. And it's also extremely ignorant. If you think that there is such a thing as better trauma and worse trauma, you are coming from a place of ignorance. If you hold the belief that what you went through seems better or worse than anything else, that is also coming from a place of ignorance. Isn't it interesting though? The compulsive comparison, the fact that we all do this internally whenever we hear somebody else's story, we hear their story, we take our story, we put the two side by side and we compare. Why do we do that? Pain is pain. Pain is pain. All pain is equal. No one's pain is more or less valid than anyone else. And I don't give a fuck what your identity is. I don't care if you identify with a marginalized people group or if you're white. I don't care if you are, I fucking hate this term, but I'm going to say it, a cis white man or a cis white woman. I don't care what your identity is. Nobody else's pain is more valid or important than your pain. And your pain is not more valid or important than other people's pain. Pain is pain. Pain is equal. Everybody's pain hurts. So regardless of the severity of whatever we've been through, the event, the circumstances, the family of origin, can we please all agree that the chronic sacrificing of our authentic selves is very sad and painful? Period. Can we also agree that someone would only do that if they were so emotionally malnourished and desperate for love and attention, whether that's from a parent, a lover, a boss, or a friend, that the attachment to the other is chronically prioritized above the self and the needs of the self and the feelings of the self. Consider the experiences that one faces that would cause them to suppress their innate nature to gain love from another person. Whatever that was or is for you is trauma. And that's the only important information we need. That's the only important information we need. Speaking of trauma comparison, what's really ironic is that whenever I start working with clients, I always have them take the Adverse Childhood Experiences survey. If you've never done your own ACEs test or know your ACEs score, I highly recommend you to do it. I'll link to the ACEs test in the show notes below. It's a quick 10-question test, and you are scored from 0 to 10. The higher your ACEs, the more statistically likely you are to have poorer health outcomes later in life. Obviously, your adverse childhood experiences are not the only indicator of poor health outcomes later in life. And adverse childhood experiences are more of what we would call big T trauma, but I really hate using words like big T and little t trauma because I think that perpetuates trauma comparison. But what's ironic is that my clients with the lowest adverse childhood experiences scores, I'm talking 0 to 3, are actually much more challenging to work with because they carry this belief, but my childhood wasn't that bad. It often feels like I have to convince them that the present day patterns they express, perfectionism, hypervigilance, catastrophic thinking, black and white thinking, needing to have control, guilt, shame, social anxiety, are actually symptoms of a traumatic childhood. Even though they weren't physically or sexually abused, even though they didn't witness physical violence or substance use, even though they didn't grow up in homes with divorced or mentally ill parents. I feel like I have to convince them and be like, see, you actually do have trauma, because they come in with this story of they didn't have it that bad. I think it's pretty dismissive of the majority of people who have low ACEs scores, because most people have low ACEs scores, to perpetuate this Insta therapy nonsense, which I have seen posts like this that are like, you're an adult now, not a child in an adult body. Being frozen by perfectionism doesn't mean you have trauma. It just means you're lazy and making excuses. Everyone over-explains themselves. Stop blaming trauma. These are literally posts that I have seen on licensed therapists' Instagram accounts. That's why I'm calling it Insta therapy. The truth is that when we're triggered, we do often regress emotionally to a child state. And if we're looking at things like perfectionism and over-explaining ourselves and all that kind of stuff through the lens of compassion and understanding instead of a lens of judgment, then we would be able to empathize with someone who's in a perfectionistic pattern. And instead of being like, oh, being frozen by perfectionism doesn't mean you have trauma, it just means you're lazy and making excuses. Well, actually, no, that's a really ignorant thing to say. Perfectionism is actually a biological symptom of the state of freeze in the nervous system. It is not actually an indicator of laziness. In fact, the body can put on the brakes because we're about to do something that's rooted in perfectionism, and the body is so smart to be like, nah, bitch, we're not doing that. That's not authentic for us. But because of our capitalistic, exploitive, fucking judgmental society, we see that and we go, oh, you're lazy. No, lazy is a construct made up by capitalism to shame people who aren't being productive. We would also be able to understand that over-explaining yourself is actually a trauma response, and over-explaining your boundaries because you have fear and anxiety about your boundaries is hardcore evidence of someone who was never allowed to have boundaries, and now you're learning how to have boundaries. Do some people live in a perpetual state of victimhood without taking responsibility for themselves and use their traumas and triggers to justify why they shouldn't be expected to function in healthy ways? Absolutely yes. Yes, that happens. I have clients who do that sometimes, and I call them out on it every single time, and I tell them to stop parking their power and making themselves a victim. But do some people genuinely not understand how having a somewhat okay childhood with pretty great parents can still result in hypervigilance, perfectionism, codependency, binary thinking, and anxiety? Also, yes. Also, yes. It is not up to any mental health practitioner to tell people what counts as trauma and what doesn't. A practitioner's job is to educate, to hold space, and to point people back to themselves, period. When practitioners do this, most people are naturally going to understand that they have these adaptive survival responses and thinking patterns that keep them stuck and prohibit healthy functioning and relationships. When you can hold space for that, people can naturally get there on their own. You don't have to spoon feed it to them. Interestingly, speaking of binary thinking, one of the signs of a nourished nervous system is the ability to hold multiple perspectives and realities without being threatened by the perspectives and realities that challenge or disagree with you. It took me several years of intense trauma work to be able to hold the two opposing perspectives, that it was true that my parents probably did the best they could with what they had, and also my own perspective, which is my reality of trauma, because what they did wasn't enough. Those are very dissonant realities and perspectives, and yet they are both true. I cannot deny that my parents were under-resourced and under-supported in processing their emotional baggage. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Talking about therapy and trauma was a thing that you only did with a shrink, and people made fun of you, and it was a taboo topic, right? My parents didn't have access to the internet or the vast amount of health resources and options that we do today. And they lived in a time when talking about mental health was socially inappropriate. Like, I cannot deny that that was my parents' experience. And also, I still needed to be able to access, feel, and express grief and anger over not having the parents that I needed and deserved. And for all the ways that I learned to self-abandon, to force love to stay so that I wouldn't get abandoned, and for the anxiety and low capacity for stress that I might always carry. My parents could have been doing their best. Your parents could have been doing their best. And yet, your lived experience and your resulting dysregulation shows that their best may not have been good enough for you and your emotional needs. It's a necessary part of healing to be able to notice your own internalized shame that is there because your parents' critical voices morphed into what you now think is your own internal shaming voice, and use a healthy fight response with anger to redirect that internalized shame into blaming your parents. This doesn't mean that you have to yell and scream at your parents and shame them for being so awful, but in private, in your heart, in your sacred healing work, that may be a necessary exercise for a younger version of you. About 2 years ago, I did a therapeutic letter writing exercise where I wrote her a letter that I wasn't going to send her. And here's one of the things that I wrote in her letter that emphasizes what I've just said. I said, I believe in so many ways that I had it so much better than you did, than my mother did. I can pinpoint moments in my childhood when you were really trying and succeeding at being a good mother. And because I know those moments exist, it makes me feel bad to stand in my truth that all of those efforts still weren't enough. I am in the very complex position of feeling torn between the total understanding that you were unequipped to be the mother I needed and the acknowledgement of my own pain and trauma for which you are responsible. I still get chills whenever I read that quote. Most of us, including myself, are in trauma recovery for a really long time before we can acknowledge that our parents were probably doing their best and that we have been profoundly affected by how their best wasn't nearly good enough. And we can still love our parents and we can still want them in our lives, right? Multiple complex dissonant perspectives can be true. So if any Instagram therapists and coaches who post things like quit blaming everything on trauma and take responsibility for yourself are listening or watching this right now, I challenge you to notice how, although it might be technically true, it could also deter people who genuinely need help from seeking it, because newsflash, those of us with complex trauma already believe that we shouldn't need help because our childhoods weren't that bad. Okay, I'm going to stop ranting now. So let's get back into emotional nourishment now that I just had that little rant. Societal, familial, and cultural conditioning have pathologized our sensations of our bodies and our feelings to the point that we believe they're the problem. In addition to conditioning that teaches us to hide, deny, ignore, fix, and change bad emotions like grief, shame, anger, unworthiness, and anxiety, we are also conditioned to strive for positive emotions all the time. Joy, peace, optimism, satisfaction, happiness, all the time. This is disgustingly demonstrated in many New Age spiritual circles where people are taught to remain in a never-ending state of love and light and positivity to manifest the abundance they desire. I have really big problems with this flavor of spirituality, which includes manifestation as capitalistic greed, by the way, and positivity as a toxic way to spiritually bypass very real pain, and a focus on what's most beneficial for the individual over what serves community. I have a really, really, really big problem with this way of New Age thinking. Only judgment, which by the way is not a very spiritual thing at all to the New Age people who are so spiritual that they are literally judging emotion instead of feeling emotion, not spiritual at all. Only judgment says that grief, shame, and anger and anxiety are bad, and joy, peace, optimism, and satisfaction are good. But all emotions are part of the human experience. You were created and put on this planet to experience the full range of human emotions, not just the shit on the love and light side. There is no way we can avoid the bad feelings and only feel the good feelings. Even judgment itself is neither good nor bad. But it does force us to decide what is good and what is bad, most of which is not absolute, but relative to each person's subjective perspective, nervous system state, conditioning, trauma, and other really personal factors. Avoiding feelings, feeling afraid to feel our feelings, and dissociating from our feelings are not nourishing responses. We are not emotionally nourished if those are our patterns. These behaviors, these patterns are characteristic of a nervous system that is feeling extremely unsafe and malnourished. We even have all kinds of tools to help us distract and dissociate ourselves from feeling our feelings. We have these smartphones, we have Netflix, alcohol, weed, benzos, SSRIs, porn, gambling, social media, and New Age spirituality that all allow us to successfully bypass our feelings. So by the time someone finds me and hires me, they have usually realized that all of their avoidance tactics aren't working as well as they thought. Talking about their feelings and doing cognitive behavioral therapy is not providing the relief of the physical, mental, and emotional symptoms. Mantras and affirmations stopped working for them too because, shocker, telling yourself that you're safe when your body is in a triggered state is literally just lying to yourself. So emotional nourishment, if we're going to do the opposite of bypassing and malnourishing ourselves emotionally, we have to nourish ourselves emotionally, which means we have to allow, accept, and feel our feelings, whether or not they make sense, whether or not they are comfortable, and whether or not they're rooted in a past trigger or in the present moment. I'm talking about unconditional acceptance of feelings. This is a crucial step in all trauma healing and nervous system work. We have to give our bodies disconfirming experiences of feeling complex emotion without judgment, without being shamed, without being isolated, without being punished. We have to show ourselves that we can feel hard things and still be okay. Nourishing ourselves emotionally necessitates awareness and effort to confront past painful experiences and present feelings and painful experiences. So let's talk about the very misunderstood, very underexpressed, and oddly scary emotion of anger. You have likely been on the receiving end of someone's rage, or you have seen unhealthy anger in action, right? We all have. Maybe you've been the person who's been expressing rage or unhealthy anger. I typically see two patterns with anger. I know there are more, but these are the two most common that I see. In the first pattern, the child grows up in a home where solving problems came by way of angry violence. So that child witnessed one or both caregivers being violent toward each other or towards the children. The emotion of anger came out as rage, abuse, yelling, screaming, throwing objects, slamming doors, passive aggressiveness, and violence. So when the child grows up, that child is going to be cut off from her anger because her experiences with mutated forms of anger by people who were supposed to love and protect her formed a subconscious belief, which is something like, well, if that's what anger looks like, I don't want any part of it. I don't want to be bad like that. I don't want to be mean like that. So the adaptive pattern is then to repress or suppress anger, and anger becomes off limits because as an adult, we don't know how to hold the charge of anger without hurting ourselves or hurting other people. We've only ever seen these unhealthy expressions of anger modeled, so we don't know what to do with our anger when we feel it. So we suppress. That's what makes the most sense. The suppression seems to be protecting us from hurting ourselves or hurting others. Like we're not making someone our victim the way that we were once a victim, but we're still totally cut off from our own anger, which means we're totally cut off from the exact energy we need to be able to set boundaries, to assert ourselves, to protect ourselves or protect other people, to have drive and motivation and courage. You can't have any of that without anger. The second most common pattern that I see for anger in adults is when, as a child, they were punished for their expressions of anger. So the child is denied the fundamental need of their own personal boundaries and faced punishment for expressing dissent or having a tantrum, for insisting on their own truth. So their anger wasn't allowed and it resulted in some form of punishment. They were isolated, put in timeout, they were spanked, they had toys taken away, food was taken away. And so then they grow up and now they are also cut off from their anger. Their experiences with their caregivers who weren't able to emotionally attune to them when they were angry have formed a subconscious belief that something like, I can't be angry or I'll be punished. Being angry means I lose connection. Being angry means I lose fun. It means I lose food. It means I get physically hurt. Of course I don't want to be angry if it means I'm going to get hurt or have something taken away from me. So then as an adult, anger is off limits because we don't know how to hold the charge of anger at all. We were never given the opportunity to fully feel and express anger before it was stopped with punishment. So the adaptive pattern is to suppress or repress anger, and it also makes sense, just like the first pattern. The pattern protects you from losing connection. As long as you stay silent and cut off from your anger, if you don't assert yourself, if you don't set boundaries, it pretty much guarantees you're not going to lose another attachment relationship, right? Or so we believe. Of course, not every child grows up and suppresses anger. The pendulum swings both ways, and we probably all know, or maybe we've been these adults ourselves, whose relationships with anger resembles their own parents' mutated expressions of anger. And there's that generational pattern that isn't being met with awareness, and the harmful behaviors of yelling, slamming doors, violence, and abuse continue. On the surface, it may seem as if anger itself is the problem. But remember, emotions are neutral, they're just energy and motion. So how can a neutral energy and motion be the problem? Well, let's understand anger more. Anger is the primary emotion of our fight response. We need our nervous system to be able to detect a threat, increase our heart rate, increase our breathing to become quick and shallow, and tense our muscles because we need that extra blood flow and oxygen for our bodies to have the energetic resources it requires to protect itself. You need a lot of blood flow, a lot of muscle strength, and a lot of oxygen if you're going to fight a bear or if you're going to run away from a bear. But we're just talking about the fight response right now. So this physiological response, increased blood flow, muscle tension, increased shallow breathing, pupils dilating, are the physiological responses of the body preparing to defend itself using force if necessary. When it's not met with awareness, anger energy can be really harmful. And it can result in things like yelling, abuse, violence, rage, passive aggressiveness, throwing things, slamming doors, etc. But When we meet anger with awareness, the very same energy can be channeled into healthy self-defense, boundary setting, asserting yourself, and protecting others who can't defend themselves. Same energy. So anger that isn't met with awareness, meaning you're not in conscious and somatic awareness of what you're feeling, can definitely have bad outcomes, for sure, especially for those on the receiving end or the witnessing end of it. But when anger is consciously sensed and felt in the body, it is a messenger. It's a very important messenger from our bodies, and it is letting us know that someone has crossed a line and we might need to defend ourselves. Not always physically. We can defend ourselves with words or boundaries. Also, anger is the same energy that's needed for motivation and drive and leadership and courage. So it's not bad and it's not wrong. If you have a subconscious belief that anger is bad and wrong, this is a really great moment to be aware of that belief and get really curious. I wonder what purpose it serves to suppress your own anger. I wonder why you're in a pattern of suppressing your anger. What was your experience of anger growing up? What did you witness? What were you on the receiving end of? And does your relationship with anger make sense to you in the context of those experiences? I would bet that it probably does. All of this that's true about anger is true about every other emotion. Anxiety, it's not bad, it's not wrong. It's just trying to protect you from something. Even shame, it's also a messenger. What is your body saying with the message of anxiety or shame? How are anxiety or shame trying to protect you? Whatever emotions you feel, whatever sensations you notice, because that's usually how we know we're feeling an emotion, is we feel it as a sensation that we identify as an emotion. It's not bad or wrong. The emotion itself is not the problem. I'll repeat that. The emotion itself is not the problem. The problem is always a lack of consciousness and not knowing how to channel the energy of an emotion in an integrated and productive way. Feelings are the only way our body has of speaking to us. We can speak the languages of English, French, Chinese, Japanese, like we can speak those languages, but the body doesn't speak in that language. The body doesn't speak English or French. The body speaks in sensation. That is the language of the body. Is the only language our body has. We suffer when we resist what we feel. And judging our feelings is a form of resistance. Avoiding our feelings is a form of resistance. Denying what we feel is a form of resistance. But at any moment, you have the opportunity to be present with what you feel and meet it with curiosity. So some curiosity questions that you can ask yourself, especially if you notice yourself defaulting into a pattern of judgment when you notice a feeling. Curiosity is always the antidote to judgment. So flip that judgment and turn it into curiosity. Isn't this interesting? Isn't it interesting that I'm feeling this anger? I wonder what this is about. What is the voice in my head saying about this? Is this actually a problem? When have I felt this way before? Really important questions. If you're in a triggered state and you can't be curious, you're not going to get the answers to that. That's why it's so important to be in awareness and be able to meet yourself with curiosity instead of judgment. Now I want to move into validating feelings. One of the most nourishing emotional gifts that we can give to someone else is to validate how they feel, even if we don't understand how they feel. Are all feelings valid? Let's explore what valid means first. We know that feelings are definitely not indicators of fact. You can feel something, but that doesn't make it factually true. Feelings always come with bias. It's also likely that our personal feelings about a particular thing are different from other people's personal feelings about the same thing. And what the ego likes to do is it likes to say, oh, you feel differently than how I feel. Well, that makes me right and that makes you wrong, right? Romantic partners, Jesus Christ, in working with couples since the summer of 2024, romantic partners can argue eternally over situations simply because they have different feelings about the same situation. And even if they want the same outcome, they'll still argue because egos attach to feelings really quickly. Egos like to identify with feelings. And when two egos are attached to their own subjective emotions, it often results in circular conversations and patterns that escalate into conflict and fights. In these arguments, nobody's actually hearing each other because each person's ego is trying to make their feelings right by making the other person's feelings wrong. So you might have a voice in your head that sounds something like, if they feel the same way I feel about this, then their feelings are valid. But if they feel differently, their feelings are not valid, or they're not as valid as mine. That's not the road we want to go down. Instead, as you learn to nourish yourself emotionally, you can learn to nourish other people emotionally. So instead of their feelings are only valid if they agree with me, what if we were more curious? And what if we were more open to other people's perspectives and didn't need to automatically make their perspective wrong? What if we were just able to meet someone in their feelings and just say, I don't share the same feelings that you have about this, but I can totally see why you feel the way you feel. That's valid. That isn't actually hard to do. It acknowledges the truth that you feel differently, but it doesn't dismiss or override how one person feels over another. No one's feelings are right. No one's feelings are wrong. And I think that we are capable of doing this to the extent that we do this for ourselves. We can validate other people's feelings to the extent that we can validate our own feelings, especially when our feelings don't make logical sense. I do believe that all feelings are valid in that regardless of why the feeling is there, it's there. That is valid. I may not understand it or share it or feel it myself, but that's what their experience is. So that's real, which means it's valid. In conscious relationships, each person can validate the other's feelings without allowing the feelings to determine the facts of what's happening, what decision needs to be made, etc. I have often observed that couples tend to lump how they feel about something together with what they think should be done about it. I'll give an example from my own relationship with David to illustrate this point. So in the episode about ancestral nourishment, which was 2 episodes ago, I mentioned generational patterns of scarcity that I inherited from my maternal lineage. I often have anxiety about money. When I notice that our bank account balance is getting lower than what my comfortable edge is, I start feeling constricted, worried, and like I start trying to control our finances. So I will go to David and I will express my fear about money, which is valid because that's what I'm experiencing. But usually he doesn't share my anxiety about finances at all, which is also valid because that's his experience. I don't want to feel anxiety about money, but my feelings tell me that the right decision is to cut back on spending, to work more, to come up with new ideas, to bring in more income. It's a sneaky belief that says, because my feelings are valid, then this logical decision that I want to make is also valid and right. And by making this decision to cut back on spending and generate more income, I can stop the feeling of anxiety. But that doesn't consider David or his experience or his feelings in it at all. So in this scenario, I am lumping the validity of my feelings together with the decision that I feel should be made about our finances. I think it's the right decision to restrict our spending. I think it's the right decision to find more ways to generate more income because I don't want to feel the anxiety and the urges to control. So what am I doing? I'm fixing my feelings by fixing the situation. But David doesn't share my feelings. He isn't anxious or experiencing the urge to control our spending habits. So if we only make the decision about what we do with our finances based on my emotions, it's going to involve unfairly restricting David's spending and force him to work more to assuage my fears. But the truth is, apart from my emotions, the facts are that my anxiety about our finances is older than my actual marriage. I came into my marriage with generational patterns of scarcity, scrimping, saving. I am the descendant of direct maternal ancestors who had to pinch pennies in order to survive. But that is not the reality that I'm currently in today. My feelings can be valid, and also the right decision might not actually be to control our spending and work more. Or we may decide together that it's wise to cut back on our spending, work more, or take other right action. Is this making sense? We nourish our people when we can validate how they feel. And we nourish ourselves emotionally when we can separate how we each feel from the decision that we make or the result we want. Because all feelings are valid, but feelings don't represent fact. This also invites reciprocity into the relationship, which is a huge part of relational nourishment. And it allows us to ground into conscious decision making instead of fear-based decision making because we're trying to get rid of yucky feelings. Since emotion is energy, it wants to move. Energy moves. It is nourishing to feel our feelings. It is equally nourishing to move our bodies with our feelings. And if we remember that egos love to quickly attach a story and meaning to how we feel, then it makes sense why talking about our feelings is much more accepted in our very intellectual culture than engaging in unconventional motions and movements that don't make logical sense. But emotions are not logical experiences. You're not experiencing emotions in your mind. You're experiencing emotions in your body. They're felt experiences. They're energetic experiences. Somatic practices that bring the body online, are far more effective for feeling, releasing, and healing the body of past painful, unprocessed experiences than talking about them and intellectualizing about them ever is. We know this without a doubt. There's so much research and there's so much information from somatic greats like Peter Levine that the somatic experience of feeling and processing emotions through the body, not through the mind, not through talking, results in greater rates of trauma resolution and integration. We know this scientifically. And while some modalities like somatic experiencing require the guidance of a certified practitioner, embodiment of emotion can be done alone in the privacy of your home. To quote my good friend Chelsea Horton, the founder of healingembodied.com, embodiment is simply this. If what you're feeling had a dance or a movement, what would it be? Do that thing. Embodying emotion allows the whole body to become the emotion. It requires full presence with whatever you are feeling. It keeps the energy of the emotion in motion rather than it becoming stuck, which is common whenever people intellectualize and talk about their feelings. And we stay stuck in the story and successfully bypass or avoid the actual feeling when we talk about it. But when we embody emotion, there is no stuckness. There is no bypassing. We're so present with what we're feeling that we move with the feeling. And sometimes that looks really strange because it's not rational. So in a world that elevates the rational logic of what we can scientifically prove, emotional nourishment requires a deep acceptance that what you feel and how the energy moves isn't scientific or logical. It's primal. It's illogical. How one person embodies anger is likely going to be different from how someone else embodies anger. The same is true for all other emotions. At the very beginning of the Nourish Your Nervous System video and podcast series, I talked about how disconnected, diseased, and disembodied our society is. We live in our heads as if we don't have bodies attached. We're living in the top 10% of our bodies, and we have this 90% down here that we're not even connected to. We filter everything through thought and intellect. What we can definitively prove with facts, research, and double-blind studies is elevated over what is felt, intuitive, and experienced in the body. And yet, trauma and its resulting consequences are not mental at all. It's not in your head. It's physical. It occurs within your body, not within your mind. And when you move with emotion rather than judging, repressing, or talking about it, you are embodied, meaning in your body. My clients share a common concern. Almost universally, they have this concern, and that is the fear that fully experiencing and feeling their feelings is going to monopolize all their time and energy. There's a worry too that particularly intense emotions could potentially overtake them and overwhelm them. And I smile when they share that because I know that over the course of our work together in the not too distant future, they are going to have practiced being present with their feelings and feeling their feelings, and they will laugh that they once worried that the floodgates of their emotions were going to open and drown them with never-ending pain. It's actually the opposite. When we actually feel our feelings, getting overwhelmed and drowned with pain doesn't really happen. We're already in pain through the avoidance or denial of our feelings. But by fully feeling and being present with our emotions, we can resolve the pain and it decreases and we can feel resolution and integration. So as you're nourishing yourself in wholeness and you're thinking about emotional nourishment, the most nourishing thing you can do for your emotions is to feel your fucking feelings. Give them space. Move with them. Don't just talk about them and don't try to distract yourself from them or ignore them or suppress them or avoid them. Be with them. Feel them. And fuck around and find out what it would be like to give that emotion some movement, to fully become it in your body and embody it and let it fizzle out naturally, because energy will fizzle out naturally or it just changes forms, right? It's not going to stay anger energy forever. It's eventually going to turn into something else, but only if you feel it and only if you're present with it. And then also, as you're nourishing your emotions, learn how to start validating your emotions instead of gaslighting yourself and bypassing your reality. You don't have to be so spiritual that you never feel anything except for positive all the time. That's not real. That's not possible. When we avoid our feelings, we disconnect from our bodies. Healing only happens in connection with our bodies. And we are not fully connected with our bodies if we're not fully connected with our emotions and if we're emotionally malnourished. That's the end of this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can get a whole lot more information about emotional nourishment, as well as spiritual nourishment, ancestral nourishment, physical nourishment, mental nourishment, and relational nourishment in my book, Nourish Your Nervous System. It's less than $20. You can get it as an instant download, as an ebook. It also comes as an instant download as an audiobook. The two of them are together. The audiobook is over 7 hours long and it is narrated by yours truly. So it is the length of a full-length book, but you can take it with you wherever you go. You can read on your phone, read on your tablet, your laptop, or you can listen to it. So you can check that out at lindseylockett.com/nourish, NOURISH, and stay tuned because we have a couple more episodes in the Nourish Your Nervous System series before we finalize with the crowning jewel of the Nourish Your Nervous System series, which is going to be about authenticity. So you're definitely going to want to stay tuned for that episode. I'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode. Stay in touch with me by joining my email list at lindseylockett.com/email. And feel free to follow along on Instagram at I am Lindsey Lockett. Finally, you can check out all of my offerings, including courses, private coaching, and workshops on my website at lindseylockett.com.